No more rats. No more of that. We've been playing around with this all day here. I'm going to introduce here Aleni Loudon and her honors thesis project.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, no more rats. We have moved on to more of a, I don't know if it's better than rats, but definitely not your mother's dinner table type thesis. We're going to cover all kinds of things you're not supposed to talk about, including sex, politics, religion. We're going to hit all three of them. So here's my thesis. It's sex education in the #MeToo movement, ethical considerations of abstinence-only education. So to start us off, what exactly is sex education? Well, when you ask this question to people, mainly their responses are going to be of older, white, male gym teachers apparently uncomfortable with even broaching the subject around high school students. Around censored terminology, using the words like private parts or male parts and not the actual biological terms like penis or vagina, or Lord forbid someone says the word clitoris in a classroom, someone's head might explode. And a little bit of LGBTQ plus content. From a lot of my research, I read that people were pretty upset with this. Obviously, it's little representation. But one of the things that I heard was that they barely cover straight sex, let alone what we're really going to talk about is the abstinence-only focus, scare tactics, and use of falsified information. So then, what is the abstinence-only section of sex ed education? Well, it's recently been rebranded as sexual risk avoidance because everybody has that predisposition that we have in their head when you say abstinence-only. But it is a program aimed to encourage adolescents to avoid sexual behaviors in accordance with Christian ideologies and the idea of the sanctity of marriage. One of the main things that they have is falsified information that's taught in school. They usually consist of very unhelpful examples and terms, like in explaining how sex occurs. Instead of saying, penis and vagina, they say the sperm deposit place or the sperm gun, which is just as confusing as it is, incorrect. There are scare tactics that are used to try to keep kids from engaging in sexual interactions. There was one example that I read in my literature review where a teacher passed around a little Dixie cup, which you think of, personal hygiene, yay, fun things you need to learn about. And they had all of the kids in the class spit into that cup. And the poor girl that was at the end of that line said, now if you were to drink that cup, that would be the equivalent to having sex with somebody who did not wait until marriage and had multiple sexual partners. Which is not only disgusting, but is completely humiliating for the poor girl that was at the end of that line. So you can see where the problems come up with that. There are also curriculum gaps, where they just say these overarching, very vague ideas to try to encourage kids to wait that are, again, just as confusing as they are unhelpful, like the idea of stay like a new toothbrush, wrapped up and unused. Or a lot of people have heard or are familiar with the idea of the tape experiment that goes on, where a teacher will take a piece of Scotch tape and go up to students and stick it on their clothing and then peel it off. And then as they go around 3 or 4 times, the tape will lose its adhering ability, it'll have little pieces of fuzz on it, and the teacher will go to stick it to someone else and say, see, look, the tape has lost its bonding ability, and equate that to having multiple sexual partners and gaining STDs and STIs, which is not true, and it's horrible to instill that kind of an idea towards young people. And then lastly, the perpetuation of stereotypes. They often describe males as being the pursuers, as being irrational, not having much self-control, and just needing to have that sex. And that's not always the case. As we know, there are plenty of different types of sex drives, no matter your gender. And then the females are usually described as the victims, as the more passive, the ones who have to be more in control of the situations. A lot of the things I've read about talk about it's who sex happens to, which is not how we approach sex now. And then, so where is this abstinence-only education occurring? Well, in 22 states, they are the ones that require both sex and HIV education to be taught in schools. Which sounds good when you consider we have 50 states, and including the, sorry, I just lost the train of thought, but including all the different provinces that we have, only 22 of those are mandating that we have the kind of education that teaches people how to be sexually responsible adults. 2 of those states mandate only sex education, and 12 of them mandate only HIV education. And the problem is with only mandating one or the other is that those could be very easily glossed over in a health classroom by explaining this is what this is, this is what this is what an STD looks like, having a day or two of that and saying, yep, checkbox covered, we're done, we've covered it. And that doesn't really help out anybody in becoming a sexually active, healthy, participating adult. Pennsylvania actually is one of the states that only requires HIV education, and Ohio belongs to the group that requires both sex and HIV education. They both, however, participate in the idea that you can withhold your child from sex education. 88% of schools give parents that option, and it can be both good and bad. Because if you are in a state that doesn't mandate anything, and that school decides to implement their own sex education program, and you find that it is very sex negative, it's very, it's chock full of scare tactics and spit cups and all things you don't want your kid exposed to, you can then withdraw your student from that exposure and educate yourself, provide yourself with materials, and educate them at home in a way that is aligned with your ethics. However, if you are in a more progressive state that has inclusive information that you are not comfortable with, or there are more radicalized parents who only want their kids to, implement their own scare tactics, and that can create problems because they're denying their kids that information that could be helpful to them in the future. So a lot of people say, well, if they're not getting it at school, can't they just get it somewhere else? Why do we have to have that topic in school? Well, yes, they can get it from healthcare professionals, but the problem is, especially with being adolescents, being underage, a lot of them worry about confidentiality, so they're a lot more apt to just do it without the education. For an example, there was a poll done of sexually experienced adolescents between 15 and 19 years old, and they asked them who spoke to their healthcare professional about birth control before engaging in sexual intercourse. Only 13% of males spoke with any kind of a healthcare professional, school nurse, doctor, anything like that. And only 7% of females spoke with their PCP. So then everybody says, well, the internet is out now. That should be a great, useful tool for all kinds of information about sex. Well, there's also a problem with that, because anybody now can buy a website domain name and put up whatever kind of information they want to. And they actually took a poll of 177 sexual health websites, and 46% of those addressing contraception and 35% of those addressing abortion contained inaccurate information, meaning that they could say things like how to apply a condom wrong, or things about timing with taking birth control, all those very pivotal things that could help adolescents to avoid the things that we're trying to help them negate when it comes to sexual activity, could give them false information and instead lead them down a dark path. And we found that lesbian, gay, and queer individuals, or 76% of those people, were going on the internet to look for their sex and information. 65% of bisexuals were doing so, 40% of questioning individuals, and 19% of heterosexual people were going on. And with this, you can see that the lesbian, gay, and queer community are significantly more likely to go on the internet than the 19% of heterosexual individuals. And that can be seen as a reflection of how much of their information is not being covered in sex ed classes. They have that lack, that information gap that they need the information on if they were to make a decision to have sex in the future, whether or not to have sex now. I mean, just things that they're wanting to know, and they're can be more likely to be exposed to this misinformation. So then, we've talked about sex, we've talked about politics. Where does the religion aspect come into all of this? Well, religious ideologies and World War I together made sex education. Soldiers were going over, they were fighting, they were stressed, and then they were going to have sex with these prostitutes, and then bringing all of those STDs and STIs that were being contracted overseas home to their families and their spouses. And the US government started kind of freaking out, going, no, we can't have this, we can't do this. What can we do to stop this from happening? So they created a sex education movement. They strived to keep the Christian family unit together, which was one male, which is the provider, the breadwinner, the soldier that went out and, did his duty for his family. One female, who was the homemaker, stayed home, was dutiful with the children, was focused on keeping the home. And then children, which were conceived within a marriage. And then the thing they really stressed the most was that it was free of disease and indiscretions, that sex and health should stay within the marriage. And then this definitely reflected the attitudes and the gender roles of the time. But as we know, Christianity and our society has evolved since World War I. So what about religion now? I went on and did a look into all of the more, popular Christian magazines to get a good idea of what exactly Christians are talking about today. There are many new fields, including consent and sexual health. I read one article that had this excerpt that said you should talk to their teens to let them know that they want them to know their body, to know what they want, and be able to speak up about what you do and what you do not want, whether that is abstinence or not. Being able to be informed about your own body is important. And then about sexuality. One article that I read from the Christian Century said that they boasted that Christianity, they think, is one of the most sex-positive religions currently, and that they really strived to kind of maintain that, which I found surprising, but it's great to hear that they're striving for that. Sexual and body positivity. In one of the articles, I read about yonic fonts, which I thought was really interesting and something new to me. But they talked about how nowadays the female reproductive organs, externally and internally, has this idea of being dirty, gross, impure, tempting. But the use of yonic fonts in baptism type literature and calligraphy and scripture talks about these fonts representing female reproductive organs, and that they were talking about a rebirth. And it was very pure, it was very theological, it was a very strong connection with God, and how something could be considered so dirty and so religious at the same time, it doesn't match up. So even, not even now, it's always been a body positive type of view. And then they even talk about pleasurable sex, and about how, especially with the internet nowadays, everything is everywhere. Kids can talk to each other about just about anything they want to. So you can't really lie to your kids and say, nope, sex is gross, sex is horrible, it's going to be, the worst thing in the world for you, because they're going to find out from their friends. They talked about, speaking to your adolescents, about how you want them to enjoy sex, how it is going to be an enjoyable experience with a partner that you respect, and that you should want them to be comfortable with their body and to learn what their desires are and how to communicate them effectively. And that was really important to expressing that kind of communication and encouraging that kind of speech between parents and adolescents. So, in conclusion, adolescents need relevant and inclusive sex education. Just pretty much bottom line. It's not going to hurt anybody to have this information. It requires individuals, such as yourselves, to be active in legislation and the implementation of education in the community to ensure that it reflects everybody's responsible and ethical information that you want available to your adolescents. Because if we don't teach them, who will? I'd like to thank Laura Pickens, George Branch Trevathan, Crystal Gallagher, Tressa Snyder, and Alan Morrow for helping me gather all of this bountiful amount of information that I've come across and read through and compiling this ages-long thesis of mine. My references for you all, and any questions?
We should have just rebranded our room here as the adolescent intervention. What questions do we have?
Did you find any research about the Gardasil vaccine at all, and if they talked to that with the students, or if they mentioned that? I know they're usually a little possibly older when they have sex education versus when they're supposed to be getting the Gardasil vaccines, but I wasn't sure.
I haven't read anything that mentioned anybody talking about the Gardasil vaccine, which again would be a very important topic that you should cover, because it's prevention and all those kinds of great things. But no, most of it was just focused on proper birth control, consent, that kind of stuff, body image.
What would you attribute the latest huge decline in the teen pregnancy rate that we've seen?
Well, several things. Birth control has been very much so made available now as opposed to how it was before. There are actually apps and websites now that you can go on and have a digital conversation with a provider and get access to birth control, which is really nice. And then I know a lot of people have heard negative things about things like Planned Parenthood and stuff, but they've definitely come up now and provided access to health care and birth control that's affordable for people who normally wouldn't be able to cover it before. And with the equal rights movement coming, more companies are electing to have their insurances cover birth control as opposed to before when they were not. So I think having that access itself is very important.
You mentioned several different sources, schooling, religion, internet, doctors. What about parents? What kind of information do you have about teens going to parents for information about sex?
I feel like that can go either way, because with parents, if you have a parent who wants to educate themselves, because I mean, even when I went through sex ed, things and statistics and different things that are available have changed exponentially from people who are going through now and the things that they have available to them. So as long as you have a parent who will actively reach out and use those materials and educate themselves to educate their kid in a proper way, I think that that would be great, and that would be a really nice thing, because a lot of kids in classes, it's high school, they don't really want to ask those questions kind of a thing, so parents could be really important with that. But then you also run the risk of having parents who are more radicalized or who just don't want to talk about it and shut their kids down and might even shame their kids or use those scare tactics they've heard in schools or in classes before, and it could be just as detrimental. So I think that really depends on the person that you're talking to, whether or not it would be useful.
Any other questions?
Did you find any schools that are implementing LGBT things into their sex education?
Yeah, actually California has one of the best sex education programs, and they have LGBTQ people come in. I read one article on, they had their LGBTQ members of, they had a club in their high school. They came in and helped teach about LGBTQ inclusivity in their sex ed program, which I thought was really awesome. So there definitely are different schools that go around and do that and approach these topics and stuff. It's just that my main point, I guess, was that the majority are not, and should work to keep things up with the times, I guess.
All right, well, before we give Aleni a final thank you for her presentation, let me just say that as we leave here today, we're going to be going over for closing remarks and a Thiel College choir performance right out in the lobby. Am I correct? Okay, right out in the lobby. So just right outside. Right, so just right as we walk out. So thank you, Aleni, and thank you.